searching history for buried classics. This is Lost Treasures of Gaming.
Welcome everybody to the very first episode of Lost Treasures of Gaming, the official spin-off show from the OMG Hour. We're very proud to be here. My name is Sean Evans, otherwise known as Ziantane.
And I am Syd Bolton, your gaming archaeologist, and I can be found on PSN and Xbox Live as Dirk the Daring.
Dirk the Daring, from one of your very favorite games in all the world.
Absolutely.
Welcome, Syd. This is exciting.
Very much. So this is exciting.
Yeah, the official spin-off show from the OMG Hour, because you've now been doing a Lost Treasures segment on the OMG Hour for 59 weeks now. 59 episodes you've done.
Wow, is it that much?
Yeah,
already?
We're coming up on the 60th episode of Lost Treasures over on that show. And I figured, you know what would be fun? If we expanded Lost Treasures into an actual interview show. And let's get a little bit deeper into these games.
Yeah, there's so many great games out there, Sean, that people, just maybe don't know about. And it's one thing for me to, take a couple minutes to kind of give you an overview about the game. But, in 2 minutes, I can never really get into it enough to tell you other than, hey, you should maybe go check this out and how to check it out. But it'll be great to actually go behind the scenes with developers and people that worked on these games and find out, whether it's the inspiration for how the game came about or whatever. And of course, a lot of these games are older, so the size of the development teams was often a single person. Obviously, we'll cover games that are like that. We'll also cover games that are newer, so we might only be interviewing one person out of a team. But either way, it's always interesting to find out, for me anyways, and I'm sure lots of our listeners, to find out sort of background information on all of these games.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And in your 2-minute segments, you've covered games from the early 80s all the way up to, in fact, something from last year, I believe one of your Lost Treasures was, So we will definitely be covering the full gamut of gaming from our lifetime. I mean, I have to say, I know on Friday of this week, Syd, it's a very special day. It's your birthday.
It is my birthday.
And you're turning 44.
Yes,
so you're getting up there with me, because I'm also 44. So you and I, both born in 71.
Yes. It was a great year. It's a very good year.
Yeah, that's the year when video games really started coming to life.
It was just right before the Magnavox Odyssey came onto the market, and the video game sort of was really brought into the home, and of course just before Pong was available in the arcades. So really at the time when we were both born, people were busy working on video games. So when we were born into the world, to say that people were working on them quite a bit is absolutely true. And, of course, now look what's happened to the world. There's video games everywhere. And that's one of the reasons why, a show like this, I think, is important, because as more and more video games are released and more people are exposed to video games, there's a whole slew of games that people have missed out on. And so that's why we're going to uncover those great games and bring them to light.
Absolutely. And on today's episode, we figured, you were a guest on the OMG Hour 3 years ago now. Back in the early days when Craig was still my co-host. But, a lot of current listeners may have missed that. So what better way to start this show than to interview you about your very own PC museum and your own video game collection?
Yeah, and you can find out why I have access to so many of these games and maybe where some of my knowledge of all these games comes from. So yeah, I think it'll be great.
Excellent. So let's move on to that. Let's interview our gaming archaeologist himself, Mr. Syd Bolton. All right, Syd. It's time for you to shine.
Okay.
The spotlight is on you.
Oh, it's bright.
So why don't you, first of all, just tell everybody, what is the PC Museum itself? And then maybe we'll talk about how you even got it started.
Yeah, so the Personal Computer Museum is a not-for-profit organization that started about 10 years ago, and it is a place where people can come and visit Canada's largest collection of interactive computers. We have about 100 computers or so set up in our building at any one given time, and about half of those you can interact with, and that's out of a collection of about 1,000 old computers that we have. It's quite a vast collection
Wow.
these days, and you'd only see a certain subsegment of them when you come out, but one of the keys to what makes us different from other traditional museums is that you can actually interact with what we have. And also, when you go to a traditional museum, you're looking at a civilization or an item that might be 5 or 10,000 years old, or even 1,000 years old, something that's not from your own lifetime, and maybe that's what makes it interesting, because it's from a time and a place that is well removed from yourself, and so you're learning about other cultures and other items. Whereas with us, it's kind of a reflection back on your earlier self. So you get a chance to, go back in history and play, maybe games that you played when you were younger, whether you were a child or whether you were just a younger version of yourself that played on computers. And whether it's video games or word processors or whatever it was, computers have certainly changed tremendously in the last 30, 35 years. And so, it's a little different in that regard. And then if you're a younger person and you've never experienced these computers, then it is a chance to try something to understand a little better, where the technology comes from that you enjoy so much today. If you think about it, people will walk into the computer museum with an iPhone or something like that in their pocket, maybe not realizing that iPhone, that single, small device that fits in your shirt pocket, is actually more powerful than all of the computers we have running in the museum put together at any one given time.
It's mind-blowing. I mean, I remember just a few years ago when the iPhone got video calling, as just standard. And it's like the future is now. Like, that was the future. That was like science fiction to us growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of what we have today is, from things like Star Trek and whatever, it's all becoming reality now.
Yeah, exactly. What is the oldest PC you have in the museum?
So we have a computer called the IMSI, and the IMSI came out right around the same time as the Altair. And the Altair was a computer that Bill Gates first wrote BASIC for, and really started the foundation of Microsoft, and quite frankly started the foundation of the software industry in general. So it's very similar to the Altair, the IMSI, and it's also the computer. If you've ever seen if we ever did a segment of Lost Treasures for movies, I would have to say War Games, because War Games is one of my favorite all-time movies. And in that movie, the character played by Matthew Broderick, David Lightman, he uses an IMSI computer in the movie. So if you remember him typing away and everything, and he has this computer in his bedroom, that's an IMSI.
And he's got the modem that has the phone on it.
Yeah, and he also had the speech synthesizer and all that stuff. Now, a lot of that was, of course, it's all Hollywood, so it's not necessarily the real things, but the actual props that were used on the set and what you see him typing on and what you see in the background is an IMSI.
Wait, are you saying War Games wasn't real?
Well, it had some, dramatic license, I guess they call it, whatever. But still a great movie, and actually inspired me to write my own War Games autodialer back in the day, and that's what they were called, right? These programs that would take your modem and dial numbers randomly until it found another computer. So people called them War Games dialers. So it definitely resonated in pop culture with everyone that ever watched it, and whoever was ever a teenager at that time or a hacker at that time playing with computers. And of course, hacking computers back then had quite a different connotation than it does today. So it was good times for sure. But that's the oldest computer we have.
Awesome. Now, you're saying you're coming up on 10 years, the museum.
Yeah.
So how did it start 10 years ago? What was the inspiration behind doing this?
Well, there was sort of two parts to it. I mean, initially, I was 16 years old going to high school, and I remember, that was back in the day when you were lucky if you had a computer at all in your home, first of all. And people that had more than one computer like myself, I actually had 3 when I was quite young, which was quite unusual. You were lucky to have 1, but then what happened was sort of the next wave of computers came in. So, of course, in the beginning, it was just like everyone was thankful and grateful just to be able to have a computer at all. And then sort of the next wave hit, and people were like, oh, this is so much better. Because you have to remember, there was no real standards back then. There wasn't a clear winner. There wasn't, so many companies were trying to, outdo each other. And so the innovation in home computers was unlike anything it's like today. Today, computers they're the same. They just get faster and prettier. That's about it. And smaller.
And smaller.
That's about it. But back then, these computers, if one had more colors than another or better sound than another. Now, the sound and the graphics and all that stuff are so ultra realistic that those things don't matter. But back then they did. And so what happened was I sort of saw people, trashing computers. They were throwing them out. They were doing all this stuff. And so I was like kind of appalled at that because I just love computers so much. And so even though there was a lot of brand loyalty back then, I was loyal to the Commodore line of computers, but I was still interested in the Atari computers. I was still interested in the Radio Shack computers because although they were different and I felt they were probably, less useful and not as good as the Commodore in my mind, I still was curious about them. So I saw people sort of getting rid of their computers and throwing them out or selling them very inexpensively. So I started thinking to myself, if this trend continues, which I think it's going to, people are just going to toss away computers like they toss away paper plates. And that bothered me. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to save these computers, and one day I'm going to start up a computer museum. And I made this proclamation, and a lot of my friends still remember me talking about this. This was in the 80s. So this was still like in the late 80s that I said this. And so I just started keeping computers, and at one point before the museum opened, I had almost 90 computers of my own.
Wow.
And I also had a lot of software and a lot of accessories and things to go with them. So eventually, I had talked about it. Unfortunately, in Brantford, where we're located, there had been a technology museum called the ICOM that a lot of money, almost $30 million, had been raised for in the 80s. And unfortunately, they spent the majority of the money on the building and some bad administrative choices. So by the time they got the building finished, and then they had no money to put anything in it. And so that building is now the Brantford Casino.
Yeah.
And so after $28 million was spent on the building, it was sold to the OLG for a mere $4 million.
Wow.
So you could imagine how the climate was here when it came to raising money to open up a technology museum. Even though I was doing something a little different, it wasn't a warm reception. So I decided I was going to have to do this myself. So when I purchased a home in 2003, I decided that, early 2004, I guess it was, that I would, buy a place that I could maybe do the museum with. And I found this beautiful home that has this building in the backyard, which was kind of like a blank page for me to sort of start with the computer museum. So that's what I did. That's why the museum's located in the back of my residence. It's just because, trying to get government funding or other kind of money, certainly at that time was very difficult to do. And there really wasn't a call. People couldn't quite understand 10 years ago what the heck I was doing, opening a computer museum. Today it seems a little bit more normal. There's people that are, have computer museums all over. And in fact, during our July open house, which is coming up on July 18th, we actually have somebody from Boston who runs or has a collection of vintage Mac computers and is considering opening up specifically a Mac museum down in Boston. And so he's actually coming here to find out, what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. So because he wants to kind of do the same thing. So the interest to do what I'm doing today that I have been doing for the last 10 years is getting more and more. It's the same with the video game collecting. I've been collecting video games for so many, many years, and people thought I was kind of crazy when I started doing that 25 years ago. Now, if you go on, a lot of the social media sites, A lot of the young kids think collecting video games is just the best hobby ever.
Yeah.
Something that I've known all along, but it just seems like now all of a sudden there's a much broader interest in it, and the same thing goes for computers. And I think that interest will continue to go on further and further. So, yeah, I just had the idea when I was 16. It took me a long time. It took me till I was in my 30s to get it open. And, just ended up doing it in my house. And, I wasn't sure how it would go. We opened up one Saturday, and the reception and just the feeling of it was amazing. And so many people were like, you know what, I've got such and such a computer. And so, it's to the point now where I'm not even sure that any of the computers out there are the ones that we originally started with. There might be a couple. I know the IMSI is one that we did start out with, that I obtained before we opened. But beyond that, and I'm not even I know for sure that the Commodore 64 that's out there is not mine anymore. We've gone through a few of those over the years, but it's amazing. And of course, we change the computers too. I mean, a lot of them are staples. We'll always have a Commodore 64. We'll always have the IMSI. We'll always have Atari 8-bit computers out there and Amiga computers. But beyond that, we try to change up the inventory a little bit so that if, because there are some people that come, once or twice a year to come and visit, and we want to make sure that when they come out, there's something different for them to see every single time.
Sure. Now, I got to ask you, now with modern computers, how do you collect a modern computer now? Or was there a certain date of computers where you kind of stopped collecting, and this is now the collection?
Yeah, so what we did up until a certain point was we basically said if it's not 10 years old, then it's not interesting in terms of being an older computer, and so that is the general benchmark that we work from. But having said that, the newest computer I believe we have out there right now is an iMac that's from 2002, I'm going to say, and so that definitely falls in that category. But to be honest, a lot of the stuff that comes in beyond that, it's not really that interesting in the sense of it doesn't necessarily have any historical significance. There are
computers nowadays, you build them yourself now, right? I mean, how do you put that in a museum?
Yeah, and a lot of it, like as I was mentioning earlier, there's not really a lot of innovation. And now, having said that, we're more than just computers now. We do have a lot of technology beyond computers. So, for example, we do have a lot of cell phones. We have a lot, we even have, for example, even though I'm still using it today, believe it or not, I do have a newer iPad, but I also have the first iPad. And I use it just, downstairs for things here and there, and I have it in my little arcade thing. But eventually, that, and it sounds ridiculous for you and I to think about it today, but in 10 years, when I say, oh, I have the original iPad, people are going to be like, wow, look at how old look at how thick it is. Oh,
I know, right?
Gosh. Or look
I have
at
two of them.
the size of that thing. So the things that we do today or that kids do today when they see, the Commodore 64 or some of these older computers, they're going to do those same things with other things. And we also have, some musical stuff. We have, early, Sony Walkman. We have PDAs. I'm sure you remember the Palm Pilot and those types of things. We have a bunch.
I remember the Palm Pilot.
Yes, of course you do.
Yes, I was president of Canada's premier Palm OS user group.
Well, there you go.
For 10 years.
Yeah, so there you go.
Yeah, that was. I lived and breathed the Palm OS for 10 years. It was awesome.
Right, and so and myself, I used to use the calendaring application. I'd never used Outlook to do or PCs to do my my regular scheduling of appointments and whatnot. I loved the desktop version and the matching PDA version of the calendaring application. So I used that for so long, and then I had my pleasure of actually meeting the guys that programmed that for Palm and who now work at Google. And they actually made a donation to the Computer Museum of some of their old technology. So
awesome.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. So there's been some great things along the way. And, that's the whole thing, Sean, too, is that while these computers are really cool and they're fantastic and they're great moments in time and they represent a lot of things, what we really enjoy is the stories that people have about how they use them. And so when people come to the museum, that for us, I mean, we're used to these computers. We're around them every week. It's not a big deal for us to see old technology. What's a big deal and what's really cool is to find out how people use them and how that technology impacted each individual person's life, because it's quite amazing the stories you hear from some of these people and how technology really, really did change their life.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Now, you also are a collector of video games, as you've just mentioned earlier. When did you start keeping all your video games? And tell us about how big is your collection right now?
So I don't know what it's like to trade in a video game. I hear people talk about it. You know, they go to these stores and they trade them in. It's a foreign concept to me, Sean. Always has been. But you know, I would say, like, I kind of actively got into collecting probably in the mid to late 90s. I started, you know, going back and collecting some stuff. And part of it was what happened to me was somebody came in and said to me, do you want this old Atari 2600? And keep in mind, by this time in the 90s, the 2600 was very old and would be considered junk by most people. And a lot of people still had them, and they were sitting in closets and whatnot. And this guy was looking to make some money, so he said, you know, would you give me $20? Like, he had the system and about 25 games, and he only wanted $20. And I literally looked at him and I said, well, what do I want that old junk for? Like, why am I paying you for it? I guess in my head I was thinking you should just give it to me, because I'm a collector of antiquities. But, you know, I knew he needed money, and so I was going to pass. And then I looked in the box and I saw Pitfall. And I remembered how Pitfall was a game that a guy that I went to school with had, and I didn't, because he had a 2600. I had the VIC-20. Okay. And so I had a computer, he had a console. And as much as that kind of annoyed me because he got all the good license stuff, like he had Pac-Man, right? Well, we had Snackman on the VIC-20. You know?
Oh, I remember really, Snackman.
Yeah, it was a really, like, actually it wasn't a bad clone, but it was a clone.
It was a clone. Oh, yeah.
So, of course, you know, like, the computers there was no real licensing back then as much as there is today. So it was a whole different world. So you had this, like, you know, well, I guess in a way, it's the way it is on iOS and Android now. There's, you know, all kinds of clones. Like, until, you know, Nintendo is coming out with official versions of things on mobile right now, you know, instead of, you know, Super Mario, you might have Super Mikey World, you know, or something like that, and he looks like Mario, but he's not.
Well, you had the Gianna sisters originally, right?
Yes, that's true.
The great Gianna sisters was a Mario clone for the Commodore 64.
Yep. And even the guys at id, right, they had developed a perfect Super Mario clone for the PC that Nintendo was not interested in because, of course, they wanted to run on their machine. So that became Commander Keen, and you know, John Carmack. That's how he got his start, right, making a Super Mario clone. So the thing is that, you know, I had that kind of stuff, but he had Pitfall, and I didn't have Pitfall, and I was like, I loved that game. I used to go over to his house, and that's all I wanted to play was Pitfall. So suddenly, when I saw that in the box, it changed my mind, and I bought it. And then all of a sudden, I hooked it up, I played on the TV, and I was like 12 years old again. I was like, this is amazing, right? So I then started seeking out, I put ads, classified ads, if you remember what those are like in the newspaper. Those seem to have gone the way of the dodo bird too. But I used to put
now it's all eBay.
Yeah, exactly, or Kijiji or whatever.
Exactly.
Or Facebook ads, right? Everything's online. But so I put these ads in the newspaper saying, you know, I'll buy your old Atari or Commodore, and I put in, you know, keywords like Vectrex and all that stuff, and Television and ColecoVision and all that stuff. And so, yeah, people would call me up and say, oh, I've got, you know, and it would be funny too, because of course, to a lot of people, it was like a generic term for video games was the word Atari. Because I remember someone saying, oh yeah, I've got an Atari here with 30 games. So I went to pick it up. It wasn't an Atari, it was a Coleco. But people just called stuff Atari because that was the generic word for video games almost. Like, it was synonymous with video game. So I suddenly had a Coleco, and I had a bunch of games for it. So it was very inexpensive to do that, although at one point I think I had about 90 copies of Asteroids and about 67 copies of Missile Command, and I'm not even joking. Like, I literally had that many. I had a whole wall of doubles, and of course had a hard time getting rid of them at one point. But anyway, today I would not have that same problem. So I took a little break from consoles for a while, though. Like, for example, I skipped the entire original PlayStation generation, and then it wasn't until a few, into the early 2000s, and all of a sudden, I had gotten a friend of mine worked at a call center that was a Microsoft call center, and so they had for people that worked overtime, they had a bonus gift of this new thing called an Xbox. And I remember, this woman that I know, she won the Xbox, and she's about as far removed from gaming as you could possibly imagine. And so she said,
As we are from sports, for example?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Good analogy. And so she was like, do you want this thing? Like, would you buy it from me? And I'm like, sure. And she goes, what will you give me for it? I'm like, I don't know. What do you want? And she says, well, and I think at the time, the original Xbox might have been $350 or something. She's like, why don't you give me a couple $100? That's yours. And I said, sold. So I got a brand new Xbox for a couple $100, and then I got Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex, and I was like, having been out of the console gaming thing for a while, I booted that up, and I was like, this is really good. Like, I was like, really, I hooked it up to the TV, and then all of a sudden I was back into collecting again. My fire for collecting just sort of got lit there, and I just started going crazy. Then I bought an original PlayStation. I went back and played the original Crash Bandicoot games, because I played Crash Wrath of Cortex. Thought it was awesome. And yeah, like the fact that he was skating around on the ice and it actually felt like ice, I was like, this is cool. Yeah. So so I went backwards and played the first 3 Crash games, completed those. And then I got a PlayStation 2 as well, and I got into those types of games. And of course, because I love Crash so much, I of course thought Naughty Dog was just the be all end all. So I jumped right into Jak and Daxter had just come out, and I bought that, and of course not long after that Ratchet and Clank and those kinds of games come out on the PlayStation 2. So
that's why you love those series so much.
Yeah, like I played those when my love for video games came back. Like, it's not that I'd ever really lost it, but I'm sure we all go through times where we're not playing them as much, or we're not in love with gaming as much as maybe we are at other times. And so that was kind of like during the period when I was really, really getting into gaming. And that's when my collection started to grow. I remember, just like Jak and Daxter was the very first PS2 game that I bought. And just last year, although I never have yet really officially announced it yet, I actually finished my PlayStation 2 collection last year. So now I have the entire 6th generation, so that means that I have all of the video games released in North America for the Dreamcast, the original Xbox, the GameCube, and the PlayStation 2, which is a lot. There's a lot of games altogether that make up all those. So literally, for that time period of gaming, you could say, is there a game do you have? The answer is yes, because I got them all. So my collection now sits quite north of 15,000 now. So
that's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it's a lot of games. And, almost literally adding games every day, in some way or another, whether it's computer games or, for example, we just got a huge donation of Atari 8-bit games, and all kinds of stuff that, is obscure for us that I haven't seen, or we actually just finally acquired what some would consider the holy grail of the Atari, which is Bounty Bob Strikes Back, which was the sequel to Miner 2049er. It's one of those cartridges on the Atari that is quite uncommon, and we hope to possibly even have the creator of that game on a future episode of this show.
That's awesome.
But it's kind of an interesting story because, without getting too much into it, because that's something we'll save for the episode, but basically you had a game that was insanely popular and ported to virtually every platform in existence at the time. And it actually really started an industry of porting games. If you were to look back in time as to sort of what game caused this idea of porting to multiple platforms, that was the game. And its sequel took so long to come out, and was so riddled with problems getting to market and other things that happened in between, that it's so strange that for a game that was so wildly successful, its successor did relatively poorly and was produced in such low numbers that now that has become such a really high collectible. And so we were.
So you would say it's a lost treasure.
It's absolutely a lost treasure. It's very hard to find. And in fact, the museum has been open, as I mentioned, for almost 10 years. And in those 10 years, a copy has never walked through our door.
Wow.
And, of all the games that we have, and so we're very excited to obtain that. So
the angels sang, the clouds parted, the sun shone when it came through the door. That's right. That's right.
Exactly.
So, Syd, we're pretty much coming up to the end of the show here, but I do want to ask you one thing. I want to bring something up that I'm not sure if you've had a chance to kind of clarify officially. There was last year, I believe, the Book of World Records named a gentleman, I believe, in New York as the largest video game collection in the world.
Yes.
And he actually has less titles than you.
Yes.
Can you explain why... now, I know the answer, but can you explain why it is the book doesn't actually recognize your collection as the largest?
Well, first of all, the way the Guinness World Book of Records works is that you have to apply for the record, and when you do so, obviously, because you want to make sure that the records that are out there are legitimate, there's a very detailed process that you must go through, and you can either pay them to have somebody come down and sort of do the process for you, which is very expensive, by the way, or you can provide certain things yourself, but you have to make sure that you get some independent people there, and you have to provide all these records and go through all this stuff to prove your numbers. You have to provide video, you have to provide written records, and so on. So first of all, there's a lot of work to the process. This isn't something you just say, hey, I'm over here and I got all kinds of games, I should have the record. Like, it's a very lengthy, in fact, I know Michael Thomason, the record holder that lives in Hamburg, New York, he spent the better part of a year just preparing for the audit that netted him that record. The big thing with Guinness, though, is that when it comes to video games, they do not recognize computer games as actual video games in terms of that record. So in other words, they only recognize console-based video games. And so as such, if you were, for example, to put out on a table Resident Evil and a version for the Wii and a version for the PC version would not count, even though the majority of the code, the majority of the assets and graphics and sound and that sort of thing are completely identical, are derived from the same sources. Even so, and even though, as we all know, if you think about it, consoles are just specialized computers. If you break down what a computer is a central processing unit with some RAM and some ROM and some input and some output. Consoles are just computers. So, but Guinness does not recognize them. So in my collection, there's a good chunk of what I have that is PC based. So therefore, and at the time that Michael got the record, I think I was about 900 titles behind him in terms of the consoles. So in total, yes, I have more games. I would have to, in order to take over that title, I would have to either get them to change the record or change the way they do it, which is, I suppose, possible. They have the reasons for doing what they're doing, or maybe there's a different record that I could get at some point. And if the thing is I'm not too worried about obtaining it because it's not about, who has the biggest or whatever, although, I do lay claim to having the largest collection of video games in Canada, and the reason I do that is purely for marketing reasons in terms of the computer museum. The museum, we tirelessly run. We've got 40 volunteers. Nobody makes any money at this. We do it because we love old technology and we love sharing the stuff with people. And so in order to do that and keep the place running, and I've got real world costs, we have insurance costs, we have hydro costs, things like that. In order to do all that and to get people aware of what we have so that they come and visit us, I tend to use the largest collection in Canada as a marketing thing, and it's simply because it's a way to provide some leverage to get some awareness for the place without spending a ton of money that we just don't have.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I knew you had you don't harbor any animosity over the record. I know that.
Gosh,
but I just wanted
Michael and I are very good friends, and we've often spoke about, he's even offered, like Michael's a great guy, and he's even offered to assist me in overtaking his record. So
interesting.
Yeah, like he really, there's definitely no animosity. And in terms of that, at the end of the day, like it's just, and in fact, like even for him, it's a marketing thing, and it is what it is. Like, and honestly, I help collectors locally and even outside of this area all the time to collect. It's not a competition to me. If someone has more games than I do, that's just great. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, you're doing something you love, and that's really all it comes down to.
I have an ultimate goal for what I'm doing with my collection, and it has to do with bettering the industry in general. So it's certainly for me, it's not about, having the biggest and best or whatever. It's about doing something that's going to ultimately, at the end of the day, make a difference in the world and improve the hobby that we all love and enjoy so much. And if you didn't, then you wouldn't be listening to this podcast, and you wouldn't be in the circles of understanding who has what in their collections. But yeah, I help fellow collectors all the time, because for me it's not a competition. I love celebrating video games in general, and I think we ought to do more in terms of preserving them and celebrating them, and of course making fantastic new experiences for everyone.
What a perfect way to end the show there, Syd. So thank you so much for doing that with us today, and thank you for agreeing to do this new show.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to next week's episode. We've got a great first guest, so I'm looking forward to that and finding out some very good information, so you're not going to want to miss that.
Absolutely not. Now, the one thing I want to end with is I will never forget your response when I suggested, hey, what do you think of expanding Lost Treasures into its own show? And it was just big, bold, yes! So here it is, I think less than a week later. We are doing our first show. It was fast, but it's going to be fun. It's going to be awesome. And we'll return next week with an awesome guest.
All right. See you soon.
This has been an OMGNexus.com production.